Hello and welcome to part 1 of Module 7 in our Angular series. As mentioned to you in the last session, we're going to be discussing the RxJs library and specifically observables. But before that, we need to understand what is synchronous programming, what is asynchronous programming and the need for it, the methods that developers can use to incorporate asynchronous programming into their code, and then, of course, we'll talk about observables and the RxJs library. So to begin, let's look at synchronous programming versus asynchronous programming. So in synchronous programming, a program runs with only one thing happening at a time. And we've seen that, right, in our code. In the functions we've written, our lines of code execute one at a time, right? And they execute in sequence, one after the other. But take, for example, a function, let's call it function 1. And let's say there's an instruction or a line of code within function 1 that requires an image to be returned from a remote server. So the question then would be, would the rest of the lines of code in function 1 be able to continue with execution while this image is being returned, or would they have to wait until the image is returned in order to execute? And in synchronous programming, function 1 or the rest of the lines of code in function 1 would have to wait until this image is returned from the server. And this leads to what is known as blocking, where the rest of function 1 and the rest of the program as well cannot execute. And in order to overcome this was born the idea of asynchronous programming. Okay, so let's take the same example. So we have function 1, and of course within function 1 we have that instruction that requires an image to be returned. Now function 1 will begin execution on the main thread. The main thread is nothing but a process, right, in which the entire function will run. Right? And think of a process as a place in memory, okay, and allocate a space in memory for this function to run. So function 1 begins execution on the main thread. When the line of code is encountered that requires the image to be returned, and provided that instruction or line of code is encapsulated within an asynchronous method, right, that instruction or line of code is moved onto the queue. And the rest of function 1 continues execution on this main thread. Once function 1 has finished execution on the main thread, focus moves to the queue, right? The queue is examined for the instructions that were placed there, and those then are executed in a first in, first out order. So as is mentioned here, asynchronous operations are put into an event queue, which then prevents blocking. Now, what are the methods that programmers or developers can use to incorporate asynchronous programming in their code? And here we have callbacks, promises, and observables. We're going to be looking at each of these, and the best way to understand them is through code. So what I've done is I've just created a new project, right? And we will start with first callbacks. So we're just going to write a simple function here. Let's call it do callback. Okay, and remember this function is going to start execution on the main thread. In a synchronous environment, the entire function will run on the main thread, right? There will be no concept of a queue because we're not using asynchronous methods. Here we'll say console.log do callback has started execution on main thread, and then let's have another one saying console.log to callback as finished execution on main thread. Okay, so we have these two messages that are going to be logged on the console, right? And between these two messages, we'll use the built-in setTimeout method in order to create a callback. So here we'll say setTimeout arrow function, and now we'll say this dot display message. Okay, that's going to be a function that we'll define. And after this, we'll put in another function here, this dot do something else. Okay, and now we'll define those two functions. So display message, and here we say this dot message, which is a property already declared up here. It's a string property. So this dot message equal to I am the callback function, right? And then in do something else, we'll just use the built-in alert, which will give us a message. Okay. Now, of course, we need to call this function. So within the view file, we'll call that function, right? So do call back. I just check if that spelling is correct. So now we can go ahead and execute this, right? We need to check that we don't have any errors. Clear the console, Control L, click. Now you can see we have this message. We have the alert, and then we have the callback. So what's happening here? We get the first message, right? Then we move to this instruction, right, where we are calling do something else. Note that this one was not executed. So the set timeout was taken and put in the queue. Do something else is executed. We got our alert, right? We saw do callback is finished execution, and then we get I am the callback function. So in effect, this was on the queue, right, and is executed after the main thread. Okay, so I hope that is clear. Now, what if we have a chain of callbacks? Do call back in. We just take the same line of code and copy it here. And we just say do call back chain. Right, has started execution on the main thread. Right, so now let's start creating the chain. Set time out. Okay, and what we do here is we will call another function. So this dot display another message, and we'll send a parameter, just a string saying hello. Okay, and this set timeout will be executed after 2000 milliseconds. Now within this, we'll have another set timeout. And we'll call the same function again with another string And again, this one will be executed after 2000 milliseconds, right? And we'll have two more set timeouts, right? And after those set timeouts are executed, we'll put in messages again. So now if we look at this chain, which one will go on to the queue first? So this line will appear on the console, then the set timeout will be put into the queue first. This one second, this one third, and this one fourth, right? So in terms of execution, right, remember it's going to be first in, first out in terms of the queue, right? So therefore that should execute first. So what we'll do is, this is the end of the first one. It's a console.log first callback, right? Then here we'll say, and just copy that line actually. Now we need to, of course, define that function, and that needs a parameter, so text, put it of any type, and within this function we just say console.log text, right? So I hope you've understood what we're doing here. We're just creating this chain of callbacks using set timeout. Now of course we need to call this function, so I'm just going to copy that name and put that into the HTML file. And now if we go and execute this, first of all we need to check if there are any errors, right? So we can go ahead and execute, clear the console, click, do callback chain as started execution on main thread. You see now we've gone to the queue. First callback, second callback, third callback, fourth callback. What if we had to put in a message here saying console.log, and let's make this one 3 seconds. Okay. So now if we just go ahead and execute, and just clear the console, click, started execution, first callback appears, then finished execution, right? Hello, how are you? Hope all is well. Fourth callback and the messages. So what's happening here? This message is appearing as part of the main thread, right? After these three messages appear, right, then focus moves to the queue. And the first instruction was placed on the queue is just set timeout, and so that is executed, right? And then the second and the third and the fourth, right? So if you go through the console, you'll see that's what is happening. We have do callback chain started execution on main thread, then we have first callback and do callback chain as finished execution, right? And then we have the queue, hello, then second callback, how are you? Third callback, hope all is well, and the fourth callback message. Okay, so I hope this is clear. Now, of course, when we have so many callbacks nested within each other, and of course here we just have, one instruction, but consider that if you have callbacks nested within callbacks, and then those have got a lot of instructions. So there are issues here. One is that the code will not be easy to read, right? It will be difficult to understand what is going on in this code. Secondly, in this case, after every set timeout, we would have to, check for failures or errors. So that too is very cumbersome. The third issue is we have this imaginary pyramid forming when you have something like that, debugging becomes really difficult. But this kind of a pyramid that appears is referred to by programmers as the pyramid of doom or as callback hell. So to avoid this, the structure of a promise is preferred. Okay, so we're going to write a simple promise now. What I'm going to do is, here I'm just going to put comments so that when you refer to the video later on, you know what's happening, right? So this is for callback, and this is for the chain of callbacks. Okay, and now we write code for a simple promise. And we're going to use what is called the fetch API in order to create a promise. So now let's write our simple promise. Let's call this function doPromise. And a promise is just like a human promise. Okay, it's the same concept. We promise to do something tomorrow, maybe next month, next year, etc. So it's always about the future, right? So here we're going to use the fetch API to create the promise. And the fetch API is used extensively to return resources to applications from remote servers. Now, how do we write it? We just specify the name of the file here. So assets / and I have a text file, okay, which I've saved in the assets folder. In the real world, what you would be putting here is a file that is coming from a remote server. So you would be putting the address in and the name of the file. Right? We don't have access to a server. We are mimicking that server using the assets folder. So after we do this, there's no semicolon here because that would mean we are ending the promise. We use the .then clause, which will specify what we want to do with the data that is returned. So .then response, and we put that of any type, and we need to specify what we want to do with that response. So return response dot text. We want it in text format because it's a text file, right? What would happen if we just said response? Now let's leave it at that. Okay, and then we'll say here .then response, and we say here console.log response. So let's go and execute and see what happens. We need to, of course, call this function. So we'll just copy that and put it in our HTML file. Right? Just check for errors. Right? Clear the console. Execute. We can see we get a response type object. Right? Okay. And we can't really read anything, right, in terms of the file itself. So what we'll do now is we will go back to our code, and here we will say return response.text. Okay, so that will be in text format. And then we'll say not console.log. We'd rather assign this response to a property so it can be displayed in the DOM. So this dot message equal to response. Okay. Now let's go and execute and see what happens. Check for errors. Clear the console. Click. And we get our text. Okay. So this is how we write a simple promise. Now, of course, this is easier to read, right? For example, this one is not as easy to read. If I read this, it says do promise, fetch this file, then take the response, convert it to text, then take the response that you have converted to text and assign it to the property message. Okay. The other thing with promises is we don't have to check for errors at every point. We just have to provide one point at which we will use a dot catch in order to, trap any errors that may occur. Okay. Now we need to talk about observables, but before that, let's just review callbacks and promises. So we'll go back to the slides. And we've seen with callbacks, right, they're not very easy to read. We have to catch errors at every point, right, at every callback or at the end of every callback. And of course, we have the pyramid of doom, right? So when we have a situation where, for example, a function has to take its result and pass it on to another function, and that function has to take that result and pass it on to another one, and so on and so forth, then it's better to use a promise. This is easier to read, as you can see, right? We need to catch errors only at one point, right? And we don't have a pyramid of doom. Okay. Now let's move on to the RxJs library. What is the RxJs library? First of all, the full form of RxJs is Reactive Extensions for JavaScript. Now, the RxJs library is a library for reactive programming. Now, what is reactive programming? Reactive programming is an asynchronous programming paradigm, right? So, instead of focusing on the order in which code is executed, it's focused on reacting or responding to events that occur. Therefore, the term reactive programming. Now, the core of the reactive extensions for JavaScript library are observables. Okay, this is the core type. A little bit about observables. They are like functions. Just as we need to call a function to execute, we need to also do something like that for observables to execute, which we'll come to shortly. Observables are also not like functions. Why? Because a function will return only one value, but observables can return many values over a period of time. The next thing about observables is that they implement the subscribable interface. Now, the subscribable interface has a subscribe method as part of that interface, and observables will use a subscribe method in order to execute. Right? Now, the subscribe method itself takes a parameter which we'll come to when we actually go and write some code, which we're going to do now. So let's go back to our project. Let's now write a function for observables. Let's say consider observables, right? And within this function, we start by creating an observable. Now, to create an observable, we need to first import the observable class. And we also need the observer interface. Okay, the subscribe method will need that observer interface. And here we say this dot time dollar. Now, time dollar is a property of any type. But why the dollar? So this is naming convention for observables. Whenever you're creating an observable, have a property with the dollar sign. It makes it easy for anybody reading your code to understand that this is an observable. Okay, equal to new observable. So now we've created an instance of the observable class in this property, right? And then the observable class will implement the subscribable interface, right? And we're going to specify here function, just call it subscriber, right? So now we're basically creating the subscribe method, and this method requires a parameter of observer type. So let's say observer of type observer, right? Remember, we've imported the observer interface, and we need to specify the values that this observable is going to emit or send out, right? What type of value? So this is going to be a string type, and now we can start to use the observer interface methods, right? We have a next method, and these are also referred to as handlers, right? So first of all, let's create an asynchronous or let's use an asynchronous method here, which is also a built-in method, set interval. Okay, and this is just like set timeout. It will do a particular task after a certain amount of time. And here we are saying observer.next. So we are using the next handler and what we want done, right? So here we just say date dot to string. They're using the built-in function date and converting that to string type. And this will be done after 2000 milliseconds, right? Now this will be asynchronous. What's important in terms of observables? It can also be used for synchronous programming. Okay, so we say here observer.next observables and send out values synchronously as well. Okay. And now, of course, we need to subscribe to the observable. So I have another property. I've called it subscription $1, which is again of any type, equal to this dot time dot subscribe. Okay, so we're calling the subscribe method, and that will need a parameter. So let's just call it time string, okay, of any type. Okay, and then use an arrow function, and we just say console.log time string. Okay, we'll also assign the time string to a property. So this dot message 1 equal to time string. Right, so I hope you've understood this. We started by creating an observable, and how do we do that? We just put a new observable which will create an instance of that class in time dollar, and then we define a subscribe function or subscribe method. Right? The subscribe method needs a parameter of the observer type, right, which is an interface, and it needs that parameter so that then we can use the handlers. So we have next, we also have a complete handler and an error handler. Okay, the complete handler would be used to indicate that values have been sent out. Now the thing is, we either use complete or we use error. We don't use both. So let's do one thing here. After this, we'll say observer dot complete here, right? So now let's go ahead and execute and see what happens. Check if there are any errors. Okay, we seem to have an error here. Okay. Okay, we've forgotten a parenthesis here. So that's that. Now there shouldn't be any errors. Okay, so let's go ahead and execute, clear the console. We need to call that function, right? We have not done that. So let's just take this name and then put it here. Okay, so now if we go and execute, click here, we get our message observables can send out values synchronously as well. But we don't get anything else. Now why is that? Because we have called the complete handler, right? So anything asynchronous is not going to be executed. So now let's comment this out. Okay, now let's go and execute and see what happens. So I'm going to clear the console again. Click here. And now you can see we have values being emitted every second, which is the time. Right? So this is how observables can return values over time. You can see our time changing there as well. Right? Okay, so I hope you got the idea of how observables work. Now, observables can also be used, just like the fetch API, to access or return to our functions files, JSON files, text files, image files. Right? So let's write a function now which will return a JSON file, a text file, and an image file. So we'll call this get data, right? And I'll just put in a comment here. Now within this function, we'll start by creating an observable again, but we won't be doing this, right? This is using the proper construct. Here we're using the http.get method. Now in order to use that http.get method, we first have to import the HTTP client module in our app module file, and I've already done that here. Right? Import HTTP client module and then add it to the imports array. Okay. Then what we need to do is in our class file or the TypeScript file, we need to import HTTP client. Okay, so import HTTP client from Angular common HTTP. Then what we need to do is we need to inject that class into the constructor. Right, so we can do that here by saying private, then we put in a parameter of HTTP client. And then we can use this parameter now. So here we'll say this dot observable $1 equal to this.http.get. So this HTTP, we're using this parameter, okay? And now we specify the name of the file. So assets, again, this would be a server address in a real world environment. We don't have a server, so we're using the assets folder to mimic that server. Assets / let's start with the JSON file. Now, by default, the get method will return data in JSON format. Okay, so now we have this JSON file being returned. We can then subscribe to this observable. This dot subscription $1, and this is again a property of any type, equal to this dot observable $1 dot subscribe, right? And now we have a parameter there of any type, the arrow function, and we say what we want to do with the data that is returned. Now we could just say console.log data. Okay, so let's see what this brings us. We need to, of course, call this function. So go to the HTML and just put it in here. Check for errors. Here the console. Let's click and see what happens. So we get this object, right? This is coming from the file root.json, okay, which I had created earlier in the assets folder. So now maybe we want it to display in the DOM, right? But what if we do this dot message equal to data? Let's see what happens. We go back to the screen, just clear the console, click, we just get the object. So what we can do now, because we want to use the data to display it in the view file, we can indicate to this get method that we want this data returned in a certain format based on a certain interface. And what I've done is I've just created that interface based on the file. It has fruit as a property, size and color, and of course the type, right? Now that we have that, and remember this is based on that JSON file, right? Has the same property. So now what we can do is in the class file, we can say get, and we can indicate here that we want it based on that interface. Now once we have that, then we can use properties. So I've defined some properties here. Fruit name, okay, equal to data dot fruit, right? This will be coming from the interface, isn't it? As you saw here, you have fruit there, right? Then similarly, we can say this dot fruit size, okay, and these, as is indicated here, are properties declared as string type. So fruit size equal to data dot size, right? And then this dot fruit color equal to data dot color. Okay, I can show you those properties. So you have fruit name, string type, fruit size, and fruit color, right? Now that we've done that, in our HTML file, we already have those properties being displayed using property binding with interpolation. Okay, so now let's go and see what that brings us. Control L, clear the console, click, and you get the root name, the size, and the color. Okay, so that's about using the get method to return a JSON file. Now let's create another observable with the get method, but this time we'll return a text file. So $2 equal to this.http.get, and the file name is same one we used for the promise, car.text. Okay, and then what we do is we subscribe to that. This dot subscription $2 equal to this dot observable $2 dot subscribe, right? And of course we need a parameter there, any type, arrow function. Now what do we want to do with that data? Right? Maybe we want to assign it to a property. Okay, so this dot car info, which is again a property, as you can see, of string type, right, equal to data. Okay, so let's now go and see if we get this text on our DOM. Let's check if there are any errors first. No errors. So Control L to clear the console. Click. Right. So what's happening here? So we are getting a file in text format. By default, the get method returns data in JSON format. Right? Remember I said that earlier. So what we need to do is to specify the response type here. And we do that using a parameter with this get method. And that parameter is called response type. And all we need to do is specify that this is of text format. Right? Now if we go and execute, let me just clear this. And now we have our text. Okay. Right. So now we've returned a text file using the HTTP or the Angular HTTP.get method. Let's now try returning an image file. So this dot observable $3 equal to this dot http.get, and the name of that file is carpic.jpg, right? And then we can subscribe to this. So this dot subscription $3 equal to this dot observable $3 dot subscribe, and of course we need a parameter there. Let's call it pic of any type. And what do we want to do here? Right now, remember, just as we specified response type text when we are returning a text file, for a picture or an image, we need to again put in that response type. So response type, and that's going to be blob. And interestingly, with the blob type, you can return Microsoft Excel files as well. Okay, now why am I getting a squiggly here? Because I've forgotten the arrow. Right, so now what do we want to do with that data that is returned? we'll just say console.log pic, right? Now let's go ahead and execute, check if we have any errors. Going to clear the console. You can see we have blob there, right? But it has a size property and a type property only. What about a name? Because if we need to display this image in the DOM, we need a name, right, to be used with the image tag, right? So the blob or the blob type is a file, yes, but not completely, right? So we need to put in that name. And how we do that is we can, for example, do something like this. So here we'll say this dot image blob, and that's just a property of any type, equal to data, sorry, not data, pic, right? And then this dot image blob dot name, we can use that name property, equal to, and we can put in the name of the file, our pic.jpg. And here what we'll say is console.log image blob. Okay, and of course we have to use the this keyword, right? Now if we go and look at the blob type, you can see it has a name now. Once it has that name, then we can assign to a property that we're going to use in the DOM that particular name. So this dot file name equal to this dot image blob dot name. Okay, and file name is the property we've used in our HTML file along with Angular's property binding with interpolation, right, to display that picture. Now I had muffin as well, but of course I'm not going to do that, right? We're just going to return the picture of the car. So now let's check for any errors, and I'll just clear the console, click, and we have the picture of the car, right? Now the picture of the car appears in front of the text, so we cannot see the text, but that's not to do with Angular or the observables, it's to do with CSS. Now every element in the DOM has got an x-axis and a y-axis, right? An x-coordinate, a y-coordinate, because remember they're all pixels. Now there is another index which is called the z or the z index, okay? And that one refers to how we as the user see the DOM. So now what we are seeing is we are seeing the picture in front of the text, right? We could have the picture behind the text, and we could control that using z-index in our CSS file. So if I go to the CSS file now, right, and I change this to -1, okay, and let's go and look at that on screen now. I'll just clear this console again, click, and you can see that the text appears in the front. Right, so this is how you can play around with the z-index. Okay. Also note that our picture moves but our text doesn't, and that's because our picture is absolute in terms of position and our text is fixed. Right? So if we wanted the other way around, If you want the text to move, then you know what to do, right? You will put the pick as fixed and the info as absolute, right? So now it's the text that will move. Okay, so we've seen now how to use observables to return different types of files. Let's now go back to our slides. Now let's look at the observable handlers. So we've looked at next, right? We also have looked at complete. There's also error. Okay, and then there is the unsubscribe method of the observable, which needs to be used in order to mainly save computer resources, right? Memory and time. To unsubscribe, we need to use the unsubscribe method on the observables, right? And we can do that in our code in what is known as the ng-on-destroy method. For that, we need to import the on-destroy lifecycle hook from Angular core, and then we can implement the ng-on-destroy lifecycle hook. So ng-on-destroy, and within this we can just specify this dot observable $1 dot unsubscribe. Actually, you can use it on the subscription object. So this dot subscription $1 dot unsubscribe. Okay, so that closes and cancels the subscription. This dot subscription $2 dot unsubscribe. It's dot subscription $3 dot unsubscribe, and so on and so forth. Sorry. $4 dot unsubscribe. And of course, these are all methods. Okay. So that's the cleanup basically, right? Right, so we've seen the handlers. The next thing we need to do is to look at the RxJs from. The RxJs from can create an observable out of anything, out of an array, out of a promise, out of an iterable. Okay, so let's do that now. We'll come back to the code. And we'll start by importing from the RxJs library. So import from the RxJs library. And we'll see how to create an observable out of an array first. Okay, so let's write a function for that. So here we'll say observable out of array. Okay, and here we'll say just say const array equal to 1, 2, 3, right? And then we'll say, let's say this dot observable $1 equal to from array. Okay, then we say this dot subscription $1 equal to this dot observable $1 dot subscribe. So we have data coming in of any type. Console.log data. Then of course let's go and execute this. Right, and we need to call that function, right? So just put that name here. Check for errors. We need the console. Click, and you can see we have our values, right? So that's sent out by the observable. So this is creating an observable out of the array using from, right? Okay. Now you could also create an observable out of a promise. So let's do that. Observable out of promise. Okay, and we use the from method again. So this dot observable $2 equal to from. Okay, and now we'll use the fetch API, create the promise, right? So fetch, we'll use the same file, that is the text file, car.text. Now we'll build the promise construct. So fetch, right, and then dot then, right, take the response. So we'll put that in brackets of any type, and use an arrow function, right? Let's bring this to the next line. We say here return response dot text. Okay, and now we need another dot then. So here we say dot then, right? Let's call it response text just to make that difference. Again, we'll put it in brackets. Response text. Colon any, right? So here, okay, and then we'll have another function here, right? What do we want to do here? Return response text. Okay, right, and that's the end of our promise. Okay, now we need another bracket for the from, right? So that completes the entire thing. Then what we'll do is we'll say this dot subscription $2 equal to this dot observable $2.subscribe, right? And we'll use a parameter there. So let's say data of any type. Then the arrow function. Here we'll say this dot message 1 equal to data. Okay. So now you saw what we did. We created the promise, right? And that is basically being converted to an observable using the from method. And then of course we can subscribe to that observable, and then assign the response return to a property. What is the advantage of creating an observable out of a promise? We can subscribe to it again and again. A promise will just execute once. We'll see the differences between promises and observables soon. But for now, let's go and execute this. Just check if there are any errors. And just clear the console. Click. And we have our text. Right? Now, we need to go back to our slides. Okay, we've seen how to create an observable out of anything as an array and promise. You can also create an observable out of an iterable. The next slide will talk about the differences between promises and observables. The first difference is observables are declarative. Computation does not start until subscription. We saw this, right? Promises execute immediately when they are created. Therefore, observables are useful as they can be run by, of course, subscribing to them whenever you need the result. Observables can provide many values. Promises provide one. Therefore, if you need multiple values over a period of time, it's better to use observables. Observables are not executed, we know, until we subscribe to them. When we say consumer, we're talking about different parts of the application. So the subscribe method would execute the defined behavior and it can be called again, right? You can call it with different values and therefore the computation may be different every time. Promises execute immediately and just once, right? There's no way to restart work. With observables, subscriptions are cancelable by using the unsubscribe method, right? Unsubscribing would remove the listener or the consumer from receiving further values and then notify the subscriber function to cancel work. Promises are not cancelable. Observables, rather the subscribe method of observables is responsible for handling errors and therefore error handling is centralized. Promises push errors to child promises as we already have seen. Okay, so we have looked at the RxJs library. We have looked at callbacks, promises, and observables. We will now use the http.get method to fetch data. Okay, so now let's go to our project. You know what to do, right? In your search bar, you just type in VS Code. I'm not going through that drill today because I think you're aware of it by now. Once your project is loaded, come straight to your app module file and we need to import the HTTP client module from Angular/common/HTTP. So just put that in and we need to also add it to the imports array. Okay. Once we've done that, we need to then come to our store service file, right? And first of all, comment out the import item array statement. We won't be needing it now. We will use the Angular http.get method. So import HTTP client from Angular common/HTTP, like I've done here. Then within the get store items, what we'll do is we will have the observable. So for that you need a property, public observable dollar of any type, and you need the subscription property as well. So subscription dollar n, right? So this dot observable dollar, you know this now, I hope. This dot http.get, we're getting it in the item template format, right? And then the name of the file. Now for the file, we need to create it. And to do that, in your assets folder, you can right click and click new file and then just give it a name. So I've just named it items.json. It's going to be a JSON file, right? Once that file is created, go to your global variables file and just copy this entire block. Okay, Control C and then Control V in your items.json file. We need to make some changes. We need to remove the export clause as well as the equal to sign, also the semicolon and the comma after the last element. So those 4 changes you need to make. Okay, so once that is done, your file should look like this, right? There's no export statement, no equal to sign, there's no semicolon here, and there's no comma after the last element. Of course, Visual Studio Code does help you out if you still have any errors by showing you little squigglies. Okay, so now once we've done that, come back to our service file and put in the name, right? Then we subscribe to the observable, right? So this dot subscription equal to this dot observable dot subscribe. Then of course we have the parameter and we assign to store service array the data. That's all. Okay, you can comment on the line which says this dot store service array equal to item array. Don't forget, of course, to inject the class into the constructor, right? Or you'll get squigglies under this HTTP, right? Inject the class into the constructor. So now to just go over the whole process of what we did right now, we went to our app module file, right? We imported HTTP client module from Angular common HTTP, right? Then we added it to the imports array. So you put a comma after browser animations module and then put in HTTP client module. Once we did that, we then went to our store item service file. We imported HTTP client from Angular /common/HTTP. Comment out the import item array from global variables. We don't need that, right? We need 2 properties, the observable dollar and subscription dollar of any type. And then we create the observable using the http.get method. Don't forget that we use item template here to indicate that we want data returned in that format. And then we have the file name. Remember how we created the file? Went to global variables file, right? Copy the whole block into items.json and then made changes of removing the export statement, the equal to sign, the comma after the last element, and the semicolon, right? Then we came back to our store item service file, right? And we put in the file name. Then, of course, we subscribe to the observable, right? This should be fairly clear now, right? We have the property and then assign, we have the parameter and then assign that data to store service array. And now our project should work just the same as it was with these few changes. Why have we done this? Because in the real world, this is what you'll be doing. You'll be using the server address and the name of the file to get the data. Okay. So now, if we compile this, and I need to stop the compiler for the previous project, change directory to our project. So you know what to do, right? For those who came through Node.js, you can, just type in ngserve. For those who came through VS Code, you know what to do. Just load the Node.js command prompt, change directory to your project directory, and then just type in ng-serve. Now that it's compiled, right, so now we can test to see if that runs. Right, so add to cart, add another one, right, and you can see that our project works absolutely fine. Reduce, take it to 0, we have our message, right? Okay, so this ends our session for today. In the next session, we'll be talking about Angular forms, right? So till then, take care, stay safe. Bye.